Good evening and welcome back to the archive. The great doors have been sealed for the night, and the endless corridors stretch before us in comfortable silence, just the way we prefer it when examining our most troubling specimens. Tonight, I've retrieved something particularly disturbing from the deep stacks, a thick folio bound in red cloth, its pages yellowed with the weight of catastrophe. The file bears a simple label, the Pests Campaign, 1958. Within these brittle leaves lies documented one of humanity's most spectacular misunderstandings of the natural world, a folly so profound that it would contribute to the deaths of tens of millions. Before we examine this exhibit together, if you find a strange comfort in these quiet explorations of our ancestors' mistakes, I invite you to subscribe to the archive. It ensures you'll receive word when new specimens are cataloged for our private collection. Now let us step into the shadows of 1958, when the leader of nearly 1 billion people declared war on sparrows. Case File 1, The Grand Delusion, a nation united against nature. The first document in our folio bears the official seal of the People's Republic of China, dated February 1958. The paper has that particular brittle quality of propaganda printed in haste, and if you look closely at the marginalia, you can see where some long-dead bureaucrat has made careful notes in the margins. The headline, translated from Mandarin, reads with the bold certainty that marks so many of history's greatest errors. Eliminate the 4 pests. Build a new China. Picture, if you will, the vastness of China in 1958. Nearly 700 million people stretched across a landscape larger than the United States. From the windswept steppes of Mongolia to the humid river deltas of the south. In every village, every commune, every city block, the same message was being broadcast from scratchy loudspeakers and painted on walls in bold, red characters. The sparrows must die. The reasoning, preserved in these yellowed reports, seems almost quaint in its scientific ignorance. Sparrows, the campaign declared, were enemies of the people. Each bird, according to the calculations dutifully recorded in these files, consumed 4.5 kilograms of grain per year. With hundreds of millions of sparrows across China that represented precious food stolen from the mouths of the Chinese people, the mathematics seemed irrefutable to minds already convinced of their correctness. But sparrows were not alone in this peculiar war. They were joined by rats, flies, and mosquitoes, the 4 pests that stood between China and agricultural paradise. The campaign would be total, the files proclaim. Every citizen would become a soldier in this battle against nature itself. The archived photographs from that spring tell a story that still raises goosebumps in these quiet halls. On March 19, 1958, at exactly 6 a.m. Beijing time, nearly 600 million Chinese citizens stepped outside their homes armed with pots, pans, drums, gongs, and anything else that could make noise. The Great Sparrow War had begun. In Beijing alone, according to the meticulous records kept by party officials, 3 million people took to the streets, balconies, and rooftops. Children as young as 5 were given wooden spoons and metal bowls. Grandmothers who hadn't left their homes in years emerged to bang cooking implements with surprising vigor. The cacophony was described by foreign journalists as deafening, a wall of sound that stretched from horizon to horizon. The strategy, preserved in these operational documents, reveals a kind of twisted brilliance. Sparrows, you see, cannot fly continuously for more than 15 minutes. The plan was elegantly simple. Create such an unending din that the birds could never land, never rest, until they simply fell from the sky from exhaustion. And it worked. The reports from local party officials, filed with bureaucratic precision, document the campaign's horrifying success. In the Zhuangwu district of Beijing, 83,249 dead sparrows collected in the first 3 days. In Shanghai, 681,440 sparrows eliminated in the first week. Village after village reported similar tallies. Each number carefully recorded, each death counted as a victory for the people. The photographs in this section of the file are particularly haunting. Images of Chinese citizens, young and old, holding up strings of dead sparrows like grotesque trophies. Children posing proudly beside piles of small, feathered corpses. Party officials making speeches while standing on platforms decorated with the bodies of thousands of birds. But perhaps the most chilling document in this collection is a handwritten letter from a school teacher in Hebei province, preserved purely by accident between official reports. She describes how her students, aged 7 to 14, had participated in the Great Noise Campaign for 3 days straight. The children are exhausted, she writes in careful characters, but they are so proud to serve the people. They do not understand why some of the older villagers weep when they see the dead birds. The teacher's observation touches on something the official reports carefully avoid, that not all Chinese citizens embraced this war against nature. Scattered throughout the archives are quiet notes of dissent, carefully coded complaints that reveal a deeper unease. Farmers in Guangxi province reported concerns about the balance of nature. Elderly villagers in Sichuan whispered that the ancestors would not approve. These voices, however, were easily drowned out by the overwhelming noise of the campaign itself. The regional variations in the campaign tell their own story. In the northern provinces, where sparrows were already fewer due to the harsh winters, the extermination was nearly complete within weeks. In the lush southern regions, where the birds had more places to hide, the campaign required more creative approaches. Party officials organized flying squads of young people who would systematically search every tree, every cave, every possible nesting site. The efficiency was remarkable. Within 3 months, according to the careful tallies preserved in these files, an estimated 1 billion sparrows had been killed across China. 1 billion. The number sits on the page with the weight of an ecological catastrophe, though the officials who recorded it saw only triumph. There are personal accounts here too, scattered like pressed flowers between the official documents. A factory worker in Tianjin wrote to his brother, "We beat our pots for so long that my hands bled, but still we continued. The noise was like thunder that never ended. Even now, days later, I still hear it in my dreams." A commune leader in Anhui province filed a report that includes this almost poetic observation. At the end of the 3rd day, when the last sparrows had fallen, the silence was strange. We had grown so accustomed to the sound of wings, the chatter of birds in the morning, that their absence felt like a physical thing. The trees looked naked somehow, though all their leaves remained. The official conclusion of the sparrow phase of the 4 Pests campaign was declared on April 17, 1958. Party newspapers across China proclaimed total victory. The sparrows had been eliminated as a threat to China's agricultural future. The people had triumphed over nature through unity, determination, and correct political thinking. The celebration would be short-lived. But let us pause here in our examination of this grand illusion. The next section of our folio grows heavier still, for we must now turn our attention to the man whose vision made this ecological catastrophe possible. In the personal files, we find the specimen labeled simply, Mao Zedong, the architect of certainty. The sparrows were dead. The silence had begun. And in that silence, other sounds would soon emerge, sounds that would haunt China for years to come. Case File 2, Mao Zedong, the architect of certainty. Let us now move deeper into the archive, past the grand halls of collective madness, and into a more intimate gallery one, dedicated to the peculiar psychology of individual power. Here, filed under lock and key, we keep the personal effects and private writings of history's most consequential decision-makers. Tonight, we examine the specimen simply labeled Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976. The portrait that emerges from these documents is not of a monster. Those are too easy to understand, too comfortable to dismiss. No, what we find here is something far more troubling. a man of genuine intelligence and charisma, utterly convinced of his own infallibility, wielding the absolute faith of nearly 1 billion people. The Sparrow Campaign was not born of evil, but of something perhaps more dangerous, the complete absence of doubt. The first document in this personal file is a photograph, taken in 1958, showing Mao standing before a map of China. He appears robust at 64, his face bearing that peculiar expression of serene certainty that marks so many of history's most dangerous idealists. But it's what surrounds him in the photograph that tells the deeper story walls lined with agricultural reports, all telling him exactly what he wanted to hear. You see, by 1958, Mao Zedong had been living in a carefully constructed reality for nearly a decade. The marginalia in these reports, written in his distinctive calligraphy, reveals a mind that had long ago stopped questioning its own assumptions. Excellent progress, he writes, beside fabricated grain yields. The people's enthusiasm knows no bounds. He notes next to a report about sparrow extermination, it mentions not a single dissenting voice. But to understand how a man could declare war on sparrows, we must examine the deeper currents of his thinking, preserved here in his private notebooks and speeches to the inner circle. Mao had developed what he called the mass line, the belief that the collective wisdom and energy of the Chinese people, properly directed, could overcome any obstacle, even the laws of nature itself. This philosophy appears repeatedly in his personal writings from this period. The people, and the people alone, are the motive force in the making of world history, he had written years earlier. By 1958, this had evolved into something far more grandiose. The belief that human will, properly organized, could reshape reality itself. The psychological profile that emerges from these intimate documents is fascinating in its contradictions. Here was a man who had genuinely suffered his first wife executed by the nationalists, his son killed in the Korean War, decades of struggle in caves and mountain hideouts. Yet rather than instilling humility, these experiences had convinced him that he possessed a unique understanding of suffering, and therefore the right to impose any sacrifice on others. A particularly revealing document is a letter he wrote to his personal physician, Li Jisui, in early 1958. In it, Mao discusses his insomnia, his habit of staying awake for days reading classical Chinese poetry and military histories. I have been thinking, he writes, about the relationship between man and nature. The ancients believed we must live in harmony with the natural world, but this is the thinking of feudal society. In our socialist age, man must become the master of nature. This single sentence, preserved in his physician's private files, may contain the seed of the entire ecological catastrophe that followed. Mao had concluded that the very concept of ecological balance was a relic of backward thinking, that the new socialist man could improve upon nature's design through the application of revolutionary fervor. The Sparrow Campaign was, in his mind, a perfect test case. Here was a clear enemy of the people birds that ate grain needed by humans. The solution was obvious: eliminate the birds. The fact that sparrows might serve some other function in the ecosystem was not ignorance on his part, but irrelevance. The people's will, properly organized, could handle any consequences. Perhaps most chilling is a transcript of a private meeting held in the Zhongnanai compound on February 12, 1958, just days before the Sparrow Campaign began. The other attendees, Premier Zhu Yinlai, Liu Shuqi, and several agricultural ministers, are recorded raising cautious questions about the ecological wisdom of eliminating an entire species. Mao's response, preserved in the meeting minutes, reveals the full scope of his dangerous certainty. Comrades, you speak of ecology as if it were some natural law that cannot be changed. But what is ecology but the relationships between living things? And what are relationships but expressions of power? We are changing the power structure of nature itself. The sparrows have had their time. Now it is the people's time. When Zhou Enlai gently suggested consulting with biologists, Mao's reply was swift and dismissive. Science serves politics, not the other way around. Our scientists will discover that we were correct all along. The personal papers reveal something else troubling: Mao's complete disconnection from the physical realities of rural life. By 1958, he had not personally worked in agriculture for nearly 3 decades. His understanding of farming came entirely from reports, filtered through layers of terrified bureaucrats, each one eager to tell him what he wanted to hear. A particularly poignant document is a diary entry from his bodyguard, describing Mao's reaction when shown photographs of the Sparrow Campaign's success. The chairman, according to this account, studied the images of dead birds with satisfaction, commenting that the people's revolutionary enthusiasm is truly inspiring. When asked if he wanted to visit one of the extermination sites personally, he declined, saying his time was better spent on theoretical work. But perhaps the most revealing insight comes from his personal library, portions of which are preserved here in the archive. In the margins of classical Chinese texts about governance, we find his handwritten notes growing increasingly grandiose throughout the 1950s. Next to passages about ruling with the mandate of heaven, he writes, "The mandate now comes from the people." Beside discussions of natural disasters as signs of heavenly displeasure, he scrawls, "We create our own weather." This was not mere metaphor. By 1958, Mao genuinely believed that human determination could overcome biological limits. That revolutionary fervor could substitute for agricultural knowledge, that the very laws of nature were merely bourgeois concepts waiting to be overthrown. The tragedy preserved in these personal files is not that of a madman, but of a brilliant individual who had systematically eliminated every source of contradiction from his world. His staff told him what he wanted to hear. His scientists confirmed his theories. His people, terrified of being labeled counter-revolutionary, competed to exceed his most impossible demands. In this artificial environment, declaring war on sparrows must have seemed not only reasonable, but inevitable. If the birds ate grain and the people needed grain, then the birds must die. The ecosystem would adapt. The people's will would prevail. Nature itself would bow to revolutionary logic. The personal correspondence shows that even as reports of the campaign's success poured in, Mao was already planning the next phase of humanity's conquest over nature. Letters to provincial leaders speak of eliminating flies through similar mass mobilization, of teaching mosquitoes to fear the people's revolutionary fervor, of eventually controlling the weather itself through collective human will. A man who could convince 600 million people to bang pots at sparrows until they died of exhaustion was, in his own mind, simply demonstrating the awesome power of organized human consciousness. That this same consciousness might have overlooked something important: the role sparrows played in controlling insects, for instance, was literally unthinkable within the closed system of his beliefs. And so we close this personal file, leaving behind the study where these catastrophic decisions were made with such serene confidence. The leather chair still bears the impression of the man who sat there, reshaping reality with his pen, utterly convinced that he was building paradise on earth. But let us now move to a different wing of the archive entirely, where we keep our specimens of technical failure. For while the sparrows lay dead in China's courtyards, something else was stirring in the silence they left behind, something that would reveal the fatal flaw in humanity's war against nature itself. Case File 3, When Silence Became Catastrophe. We find ourselves now in the archive's most sobering wing, the Hall of Unintended Consequences. Here, beneath glass cases, we preserve the remnants of humanity's most spectacular misunderstandings of the natural world. The lighting is dimmer here, for some truths are almost too painful to examine directly. Tonight, we open the case simply labeled Ecological Collapse, China, 1958 to 1959. The first document in this collection is a field report from Dr. Feng Zuoxin, an entomologist at Beijing Agricultural University. Dated July 15, 1958, just 3 months after the Sparrow Campaign's triumphant conclusion, the report's clinical language cannot quite hide the growing alarm in its observations. Unusual insect activity noted in agricultural communes across North China. It begins. Recommend immediate investigation of population dynamics following recent avian elimination programs. Dr. Feng, bless his scientific soul, was trying to sound the alarm in the most bureaucratically safe way possible. But reading between the lines of his careful prose, preserved here in carbon copy form, we can detect the horror of a man watching an ecological catastrophe unfold in real time. You see, the Chinese leadership had made a fundamental error, one that reveals humanity's dangerous tendency to see nature as a simple machine rather than a complex web of relationships. They had observed that sparrows ate grain. They had calculated how much grain. They had concluded that eliminating sparrows would mean more grain for people. The mathematics were correct. The understanding was catastrophically incomplete. What they had failed to consider in their rush to remake the natural world was what else sparrows ate besides grain. The answer, preserved in Dr. Feng's increasingly desperate reports throughout that summer, was insects. Millions upon millions of insects. The scientific literature we've archived from this period tells a story of ecological dominoes falling with mathematical precision. Sparrows, it turns out, consume insects at a rate of approximately 250,000 per bird per year. With an estimated billion sparrows eliminated from the Chinese ecosystem, that represented roughly 250 trillion fewer insects being consumed annually. In the immediate aftermath of the sparrow extermination, these insects, suddenly freed from their primary predator, began to reproduce at exponential rates. The reports describe swarms of aphids, clouds of caterpillars, armies of beetles, all marching across the landscape with the unstoppable force of biological mathematics. The most detailed account comes from a commune leader in Hebei province, a man named Zhang Weiming, whose daily reports were preserved purely by accident in the wrong filing cabinet. His July 20th entry reads, "The corn stalks are black with insects. They move like a living carpet across the fields. The peasants try to brush them away, but for every insect killed, 10 more appear. It is as if the earth itself has turned against us." By August, Zhang's reports had taken on an almost biblical tone. The insects come in waves now, each species following the last. First the aphids, covering every green leaf. Then the caterpillars, eating what the aphids do not drain. Then the beetles, finishing what remains. The crops that survived the spring floods that we tended so carefully are being devoured before our eyes. But the true scope of the catastrophe is revealed in a secret report compiled by agricultural officials in September 1958, a document so damaging it was buried in the deepest archives until decades later. The report, marked for internal use only maximum classification, presents a province-by-province breakdown of crop losses directly attributable to insect damage. The numbers are staggering. In Liaoning province, 65% of the soybean crop destroyed by caterpillars. In Hebei, 40% of corn production lost to aphid infestations. In Shaanxi, total destruction of wheat crops in 17 counties due to locust swarms that blotted out the sun. The locusts, the locusts. They deserve their own special mention in this catalog of consequences. For decades, sparrows had been one of the primary controls on locust populations across northern China. With the birds eliminated, the 1958 locust emergence faced no natural predators. The result was swarms of a size not seen since biblical times. A photograph in our collection, taken by a foreign journalist in Shaanxi province, shows what appears to be a brown cloud stretching from horizon to horizon. Only when you read the caption do you realize you're looking at millions of locusts, so dense they block the sun. The journalist's accompanying report describes the sound like rain on a metal roof, but never stopping, growing louder as they settled on what remained of the crops. The psychological impact on the Chinese farmers is preserved in these intimate accounts scattered throughout the official reports. A peasant named Lai Daming from Anhui province somehow managed to get a letter to his nephew studying in Hong Kong. The letter, intercepted by censors, but preserved in their files, provides a window into the human dimension of this ecological collapse. Uncle Liu writes that he no longer sleeps at night, not because of hunger, though that too is beginning, but because of the sound of the insects. They move at night, you see, millions of tiny legs across the leaves, tiny mouths chewing. He says it sounds like whispering, as if the destroyed sparrows have returned as insects to take their revenge. The scientific community, such as it was allowed to exist in 1958 China, tried desperately to document and address the crisis. But their efforts reveal another layer of the tragedy, the systematic suppression of expertise in favor of political enthusiasm. Dr. Feng's later reports, obtained through university archives, show a man slowly realizing that his scientific observations are not merely unwelcome, but actively dangerous. His August report, requesting emergency importation of natural predators to control the insect populations, was returned with a notation in red ink. Comrade Feng's bourgeois, thinking about natural balance, reflects insufficient revolutionary consciousness. By September, Dr. Feng had learned to frame his observations differently. The people's revolutionary fervor in eliminating sparrows has been so successful that insects, deprived of their natural enemies, now present an opportunity for further revolutionary action. He was requesting the same intervention biological, pest control, but in language that wouldn't get him labeled a counter-revolutionary. The technological aspect of this blunder extends beyond simple ecological ignorance to encompass a fundamental misunderstanding of complex systems. The Chinese leadership had approached nature with the same mindset they applied to industrial production: identify inefficiencies, eliminate them, optimize the output. A fascinating document in our collection is a planning memo from the Ministry of Agriculture, dated January 1958, laying out the theoretical framework for the Pests campaign. The language is strikingly mechanical. Biological productivity can be optimized through targeted elimination of counterproductive organisms. Nature, in this conception, was simply a factory in need of better management. This mechanistic thinking appears throughout the archived materials. Sparrows were labeled grain thieves in official propaganda, as if they were criminals rather than components of an ecosystem. The campaign materials speak of perfecting nature, of correcting evolutionary mistakes, of creating a more efficient biological system. The hubris is breathtaking in its scope. These were people who genuinely believed they could improve upon 3 billion years of evolutionary development through the application of Marxist-Leninist principles and mass mobilization. But perhaps the most damning evidence of the technological failure lies in what happened next. As the insect catastrophe unfolded throughout late 1958, the Chinese leadership faced a choice: acknowledge the error and attempt to correct it, or double down on their original assumptions. They chose the latter. Rather than admitting that eliminating sparrows had been a mistake, they declared victory over the bird menace and pivoted to blaming the insect problem on insufficient revolutionary vigilance. If insects were destroying crops, it was because the people weren't working hard enough to kill insects. The solution was more mass mobilization, more political enthusiasm, more faith in the power of human will over natural law. A memo from October 1958, marked confidential for party leadership only, reveals the stunning cognitive dissonance of the response. While some bourgeois scientists claim that eliminating sparrows has led to increased insect populations, this represents a failure to understand dialectical materialism. Insects increase when the people's revolutionary consciousness is insufficient to control them. The solution is not to question our correct policy on sparrows, but to intensify our efforts against all enemies of the people, including insects. And so we close this case file on technological folly, leaving behind the dusty reports and faded photographs of ecological collapse. The sparrows were dead. The insects had inherited their kingdom. And across China, the first whispers of famine began to stir in villages with Case File 4, the hindsight file, the price of certainty. We descend now to the archive's most protected vault, where we keep the specimens too terrible to display in the upper galleries. The air here is colder, heavy with the weight of human tragedy. These documents require special handling, not because they are fragile, but because the truth they contain has the power to break hearts even decades after the events they record. The file we open tonight is bound in black leather, its pages sealed with wax that has never fully hardened, as if the sorrow within refuses to be contained. The label, written in a careful hand, reads simply, The Great Chinese Famine, 1959 to 1961, when the sparrows had their revenge. The first document in this collection is not an official report or government proclamation, but something far more intimate, a letter never sent, found in the pocket of a railway worker who died attempting to reach his village in Anhui province. The letter, addressed to his wife, is dated March 15, 1960. Beloved Mei Lin, I write this knowing it may never reach you, for the trains no longer run to our village, and the roads have become paths traveled only by ghosts. The sparrows are gone, as we celebrated 2 years ago. The grain they might have eaten remains in the fields, but only because there is no grain left for anyone to eat. This unnamed railway worker had grasped something that eluded the brilliant minds in Beijing's corridors of power: the connection between the silence in the trees and the silence in the villages. The Pests campaign had been declared a success. The Great Leap Forward was proceeding according to plan, and yet people were dying in numbers that would eventually dwarf the casualties of most wars. The mathematical precision of catastrophe is preserved in documents that took decades to surface from the deepest government archives. Conservative estimates, compiled by demographers in the 1980s using census data and mortality records, suggest that between 15 and 36 million Chinese died during the famine years of 1959 to 1961. More recent scholarship, with access to previously classified provincial records, places the number as high as 55 million souls. To comprehend such numbers, we must examine the mechanism by which a campaign against sparrows became a holocaust of hunger. The ecological collapse we documented in our previous case file was only the beginning. As crop yields plummeted due to insect devastation, the Chinese government faced a choice that would define the character of the entire disaster. They chose to maintain the fiction of success. A classified report from the Ministry of Agriculture, dated December 1958, reveals the full scope of the leadership's self-deception. Despite mounting evidence of ecological catastrophe, the report projects record grain harvests for 1959, claiming that the elimination of sparrows would result in food surpluses beyond China's ability to store. Based on these fictional projections, grain procurement quotas, the amount of grain each province was required to deliver to the state, were actually increased for 1959. Provinces that had lost 40% of their crops to insects were ordered to deliver more grain to the government than they had in previous years of normal harvests. The human dimension of this bureaucratic madness is preserved in the personal accounts scattered throughout our collection. A village party secretary from Henan province, a man named Chun Yongfa, somehow managed to keep a private diary throughout the famine years. His entries, discovered only after his death in 1983, provide a window into the impossible choices faced by local officials. January 12, 1960. Beijing demands 200 tons of grain from our commune. We harvested 180 tons total, and 150 of that has already been eaten by the families. Do I tell Beijing we have failed the people and face punishment as a rightist? Or do I take food from the mouths of children to meet the quota? There are no good choices left in this world. Chun's diary reveals how the Sparrow Campaign's failure cascaded through every level of Chinese society. Local officials, terrified of being blamed for counter-revolutionary sabotage, continued to report successful harvests even as their villages emptied. Provincial leaders, receiving these false reports, passed them up to Beijing while simultaneously stripping their regions of every grain of rice to meet impossible quotas. The archive contains photographs from this period that are almost unbearable to examine, even in the subdued lighting of these vaults. Images smuggled out by foreign journalists show villages that appear abandoned, their houses intact but empty, as if the inhabitants had simply vanished into the air. But they had not vanished. They had died, quietly and systematically, of a famine made all the more terrible by its preventability. China had grain reserves in 1959 enough to prevent mass starvation. But those reserves were being exported to the Soviet Union to pay debts, or stored in government warehouses, while peasants died in the countryside, their deaths unreported and unacknowledged. The personal testimonies are what haunt these halls most deeply. A teacher from Gansu province, writing in 1962, after somehow surviving the famine, left this account. The children stopped coming to school first, and their parents stopped walking past our building. The silence grew day by day, until even the insects seemed to make less noise. I realized then that we had traded the chatter of sparrows for something far more terrible, the silence of the dead. Another survivor, a farmer from Sichuan, described the bitter irony of the campaign's success. We killed every sparrow in our county, beat our pots until our hands bled, celebrated our victory over nature. But in the end, it was nature that won. The land became quiet. Yes, but it was the quiet of graveyards. Perhaps the most damning evidence in our collection is a secret report prepared by Liu Xiuqi, China's head of state, in 1962. This document, classified for over 20 years, contains the government's private acknowledgement of the famine's true scope and causes. In clinical language, it traces the connection between ecological disruption and human catastrophe. The elimination of sparrows as part of the 4 pests campaign resulted in insect population explosions that contributed significantly to agricultural failures in 1958-1959, combined with unfavorable weather conditions and policy errors in grain procurement. This led to food shortages affecting approximately 180 million people and excess mortality of significant proportions. Even in this private document, written for the inner circle of party leadership, the language is carefully sanitized. Excess mortality of significant proportions, as if the deaths of tens of millions of people were merely a statistical anomaly rather than the direct result of human arrogance and ecological ignorance. The international dimension of the tragedy adds another layer of heartbreak to our collection. Throughout the famine years, China continued to export grain to other countries, while its own people starved. The leadership preferred to maintain the fiction of agricultural success rather than admit failure and seek international aid. A cable from the Soviet embassy in Beijing, dated August 1960, reveals Moscow's growing awareness of the crisis. Chinese officials continue to speak of bumper harvests, but our observers report unusual population movements in rural areas and concerns about food availability. Recommend discreet inquiry into actual agricultural conditions. Yet even as evidence mounted, the international community remained largely unaware of the famine's scope. China's isolation, combined with the government's successful suppression of information, meant that one of history's greatest humanitarian disasters unfolded almost entirely in silence. The final document in this terrible collection is perhaps the most poignant, a list of names compiled by a village clerk in Anhui province, carefully recording each death in his community during the famine years. The list runs for pages, neat columns of names, ages, and dates, a bureaucrat's attempt to bear witness to a tragedy his government refused to acknowledge. At the bottom of the final page, in the same careful handwriting, appears this notation. In total, 1,847 residents of Xiagang village died of starvation between March 1959 and November 1961. Before the campaign against Sparrows, we numbered 2,340 souls. Now we are 493. The Sparrows, it seems, have had their revenge after all. The Sparrow Campaign was quietly abandoned in 1960, with bedbugs officially replacing birds as the fourth pest. No acknowledgement was made of the ecological catastrophe that had unfolded. No apology was offered to the families who had lost everything to a war against nature that should never have been fought. And yet, even in this catalogue of horror, the human capacity for resilience shines through. The survivors rebuilt. The ecosystems, slowly and painfully, began to recover. The sparrows, those that had escaped the great extermination, gradually returned to Chinese skies, carrying with them the memory of silence and the promise of song. But that is a story for another folio, another night in these quiet halls. For now, we have completed our examination of this particular specimen of human folly, the campaign that began with pots and pans and ended with the silence of empty villages. Let us close this heavy file and return to the upper galleries, where the air is lighter and the truths less terrible to bear. The sparrows have returned to China's trees, though they sing now in a landscape forever changed by their absence. Archivist's reflection, the echo of small wings. And so we emerge from the depths of our examination, leaving behind the weight of those terrible files to find ourselves once again in the archive's main hall. The great windows here face east, and though it is still night, there is the faintest suggestion of dawn beginning to touch the horizon. Appropriate, perhaps, for we have spent these hours in the company of one of humanity's darkest follies. As I return these documents to their proper places in the archive, I find myself reflecting on the peculiar nature of this particular specimen of human error. The Four Pests campaign was not born of hatred or greed, those familiar motivations that drive so many of history's tragedies. No, this catastrophe emerged from something far more dangerous. Absolute certainty combined with good intentions. Mao Zedong genuinely believed he was building paradise on earth. The millions of Chinese citizens who banged their pots and pans until the sparrows fell from the sky were convinced they were serving the people. The officials who maintained the fiction of success, even as their villages emptied, were trapped in a system that had made doubt itself a form of treason. This is what makes the Sparrow Campaign such a perfect specimen for our collection. It reveals how quickly the human capacity for reason can be overwhelmed by the intoxicating power of collective certainty. When an entire society agrees that sparrows are the enemy, when every voice of dissent is silenced, when expertise is subordinated to enthusiasm, the result is not wisdom but catastrophe. I am reminded, as I catalogue these final observations, of a phrase that appears repeatedly in the Chinese documents: Zhan Sheng Ziren, to conquer nature. It captures perfectly the hubris that drove this tragedy, the belief that the natural world was simply an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a complex system to be understood. Yet nature, as the archive specimens consistently demonstrate, cannot be conquered, only ignored at our peril. The sparrows did not disappear to make way for human progress. They died, and in their dying, revealed the intricate web of relationships that sustain all life, including our own. In the decades since the famine, China has become one of the world's leading nations, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty, achieving technological miracles that would have seemed impossible in 1958. The survivors of those terrible years built a better world, one that remembered, however quietly, the price of certainty without doubt. But the lesson extends far beyond China's borders. In every age, in every society, we find the same dangerous pattern. The moment when confidence becomes dogma, when questioning becomes betrayal, when the complexity of the world is reduced to simple slogans that fit on banners and sound compelling in speeches. The sparrows have returned to China's trees, of course. Walk through Beijing today, and you will hear their chatter in the early morning, see them flitting between the branches of parks and gardens. They carry no grudges, these small descendants of survivors. They simply sing and nest and eat their daily portion of insects, fulfilling their ancient role in the web of life with unconscious grace. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson preserved in tonight's folio. The importance of listening to small voices before they are silenced forever. The sparrows tried to tell us something through their mere existence, that they were part of something larger, something more complex than human politics could comprehend. But in 1958, no one was listening to sparrows. Everyone was listening to the sound of pots and pans. The files are closed now, returned to their proper shelves, where they will wait for future visitors to this quiet archive. The story they tell of good intentions leading to terrible consequences, of certainty becoming catastrophe, of the price we pay when we stop listening to the natural world, will remain here, preserved in amber, a warning from the past to any who care to heed it. As I prepare to lock the archive's doors once more, I find myself grateful for the sparrows outside these windows,